What's going on, Packer fans? Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. I'm going to be fully transparent. I am exhausted. I just got back from Bob Dylan in Milwaukee, which was, by the way, fantastic. It is 12:32 a.m. as I am recording this, so I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet, which means I will probably drone on for about 45 minutes, of course, but we do have a lot to get to because it was trade deadline day, and of course the show doesn't stop, and it doesn't matter if I'm exhausted or not. There is plenty of Packers stuff to talk about, so let's start off right away with the trade deadline, and of course, the Packers are in on every conversation, but no deal as of the end of the trade deadline, which means no trades for Green Bay the remainder of this season, which means they are at the end of the waiver priority, which makes it even harder to claim players moving forward. So that's that. And I want to start off by saying I'm not surprised. If any of you have been Packer fans for, I don't know, more than a week, you will know that this is the same story and same movie that we have watched over and over and over for the course of forever. It's very rare that Green Bay gets involved at the trade deadline. And even when Matt LaFleur said that Brian Gutekunst and his staff were working very hard to try to make something happen, it always felt to me, as I mentioned yesterday, that this was we're going to do everything we can to get in on every conversation. But, at the end of the day, it takes two to tango, if you will. And I kind of want to go over that first. Yes, Green Bay did not make a move, and there were very few moves. Of course, we had Von Miller the other day. We had Melvin Ingram go from the Steelers to the Chiefs. We had Laurent Duvernay-Tardif go from the Chiefs to the Jets. We had Kerry Vincent traded. Charles Omenihu got traded, but overall, not a ton of action on the trade deadline per usual. So why is that exactly? Why aren't there more trades? Why isn't this like the Major League Baseball trade deadline or the NBA trade deadline where you see usually a variety of moves and a lot of times the rich getting richer and the poor trying to do everything they can to maybe lose more games to get a better draft pick? Well, there's a variety of factors at play here. The first of which is a lot of teams that should be selling don't sell. Why is that? Let's take a look at the Chicago Bears, for example. They absolutely, without equivocation, 1,000,000% should be selling. Any player that has any value on the team this year that isn't signed to a long-term deal, that isn't part of the 2022-2023 Bears team should absolutely be traded, and they should try to get as much draft capital as possible. So why didn't they make any trades? Well, this may come as a surprise to you. Not at all. Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy just slightly on the hot seat in Chicago. If they want to keep their jobs, they need to win, and they need to win now, or at minimum, show a lot of progress through the remainder of the season. So while Chicago should be sellers at the trade deadline, they can't be because they will lose their jobs if they sell and all of a sudden win one game on the remainder of the season. The other thing, and then that's not just a Bears thing, that is a variety of teams throughout the NFL. And kind of hand in hand in that is the fact that this is just a 17-game season. This isn't a 162-game season. This isn't a 82-game season. Like, this is a 17-game season, and you have done everything in your power to build this 53-man roster, to go through training camp, to go through preseason, to go through the first 8 weeks of the season. If all of a sudden week 8 you're selling, even if you're 2-6, whatever, like 1-7, if you're selling and all of a sudden the team gets wind of, all right, two of the our best guys on the roster are now on other teams, what message does that send to the remainder of your roster? Yeah, as a coach, you can say, we traded some guys, but we'd like you to keep playing as hard as possible. That only goes so far. If you see that the front office is trading away some of your better players, the writing's on the wall. You're tanking the rest of the year. You're not playing to win games the remainder of the year. And that's a tough message to send to players on your roster and kind of going forward. And if you're a coach, let's say like the Jets, right? If you're the Jets and you have a new coach and you're trying to get buy-in from the remainder of your players, well, selling players off, especially coming off a win this past week, isn't the way to do that. You actually have some momentum as the Jets, and you probably feel good coming off a win against the Bengals. You have a new coach, and you're trying to build some momentum as a team. All of a sudden, you sell some players off, and all that momentum is gone. And now you lose the investment of those players. And now you have to wait until next year to try to gain that back. And that can be a difficult thing to do. So the 17-game season certainly affects things and how you're sending a message to the remainder of the players on your team. The other thing that affects things is the compensatory picks. So in other leagues, in the NBA, in Major League Baseball, there is a way to recuperate picks, so you do have to deal with that a little bit. But let's just take the NBA in this situation. The NBA doesn't have any compensatory picks. If you lose a player in free agency, yes, you could potentially do a sign and trade, but if you can get something better now while you still have control of that player, it's better to do something now at the trade deadline. Whereas in the NFL, if they're not offering you something that's better than the compensatory pick that you're going to get in exchange, there's no advantage to doing that sort of deal. So while the NFL does an amazing, incredible job 365 days a year of making the NFL a topic, because of a outdated compensatory pick formula, they lose out on a very, what could be newsworthy trade deadline. And this year they got a little bit lucky in the fact that Von Miller going from the Broncos to the Rams was a pretty big story. And they have that, at least something that happened, right? We've seen Jaylon Ramsey and some other players move in recent years, so it hasn't been a complete dearth of trades, but you would see a lot more if that compensatory formula went away. So the fact that there are teams that should be selling but can't because GMs and coaches are trying to save their jobs, the fact that you have compensatory picks, and the fact that it sends a bad message to your team after just 8 weeks makes it that it's very difficult to deal these players. I have zero doubt. You might be thinking at home, listen, like, why isn't Brian Gutekunst making these moves? I promise you, if you've listened to Brian Gutekunst at all, I promise you that Brian Gutekunst was itching to make some sort of deal. But it takes two sides, and you can't just go into a deal and say, I'm going to give you whatever you want so we can try to acquire this player. That's not a good way to do business. You want to, obviously you want to sell high, you want to buy low, you want to be smart about these things, and just going out and try to acquire any player for the sake of acquiring a player isn't best for business. So Brian Gutekunst and staff have to be smart here. And if other teams are asking for a premium for a player at the trade deadline, it's probably not worth it. And the other thing I want to mention here is it's very rare that you are one player away. I've heard multiple former GMs talk about, like, if you're going to trade for a deadline deal for a wide receiver, like, no team is ever a wide receiver away. Like, that is the last thing. These are nice to haves, but they're not what ultimately decides your NFL championship hopes. It's the offensive line, it's the defensive line, it's pass rush, it's those sort of things. Quarterback, of course, but it's very rarely a wide receiver. And it's also very rare that a player comes in at the deadline, sort of, integrates themselves with the team, and then all of a sudden is ready to go and really energizes the team. A trade can certainly energize your team, but they have to be able to follow that up. And for example, if Green Bay goes and gets a tight end, it could take 6, 8, 10 weeks to really even have some semblance of the cadence and the checks at the line of scrimmage that Aaron Rodgers wants to use, and the blocking responsibilities and learning this Matt LaFleur offense. The odds that somebody comes in and learns this on the fly, unless they've been in it or unless they've had a similar system elsewhere, the odds that they can just come in and learn this aren't very great. And you have to all of a sudden acclimate yourself to a new city, a new franchise, a new potentially nomenclature for how you're calling plays and your audibles and your cadence at the line of scrimmage. Those are not easy things to integrate. This isn't Major League Baseball where you say, like, we're going to trade for a first baseman, and you plug them in at first base, and it's the exact same thing you've done everywhere else. Yes, there's some signals that you have to catch up on. It's nowhere near the same. So acquiring somebody at the trade deadline in the NFL isn't just like a plug and play sort of thing. And if it takes 6, 8 weeks to get somebody up to speed, now you're trading future picks for one player where they may take 6 to 8 weeks to really get up to speed and have an impact on this team. And now you have maybe 2 regular season weeks in the playoffs to help your team win. You're trading probably more resources than you should because it's a seller's market, and sellers are a little bit stingy at this time of year, as we've seen. You're overpaying for a player that's not going to help you much over the next 2 months, and you're hoping can help you towards the end of the year in playoffs. But if they don't, and if you lose, you've just spent a future 4th, 5th, 3rd, whatever pick you gave up for a handful game rental that you didn't get anything out of. GMs are all on the same page regardless. And again, I think Brian Gutekunst would like to see a lot more activity and action at the trade deadline. That's just the way he is, and he's mentioned that in the past. But it takes multiple teams and teams selling to get that done, and it obviously was not the case. I would have liked Charles Omenihu for Green Bay, but let's put it this way. I think he would have been an upgrade for a player like Kingsley Keke. He's not, you can say, well, like, he'd be better than Tyler Lancaster. They're two different players. Tyler Lancaster's a run stopper. Charles Omenihu is more of a pass rusher. Charles Omenihu would play that Kingsley Keke role. And while I've been down on Keke has been much better the last 3 weeks. And while I really like Charles Omenihu, and he goes to San Francisco for a nothing pick, and he's got actually future years left on his deal, which would be a nice, bonus and nice to have. The difference between a Kingsley Keke and a Charles Omenihu is not that great. And are you literally telling me that Charles Omenihu is going to be the one that separates you between the Packers and the Rams, or the Packers and the Cardinals, or the Packers and the Bucks, or the Packers and whoever wins the AFC? That's who's going to win the Super Bowl champ, because Green Bay went out and got Charles Omenihu. As I mentioned yesterday, upgrading on the fringes is a good thing to do and a smart thing to do. But remember, if it's a 5th round pick, that could be an Aaron Jones. If it's a 5th round pick, 4th round pick, whatever, it could be an MVS. It could be a legitimate starting caliber player for you a few years down the road that you could really need. So these trades do not happen in a vacuum. It takes two teams to really work something out. And I can understand why Green Bay didn't want to make any moves. And it just doesn't seem like there was that much that was available at a reasonable price. And that results in not many deals at the trade deadline. Now, that does not mean that Green Bay wasn't active. They made a major move. I say that semi-facetiously, but they bring up Stephen Wirtle. It is Stephen Wirtle hour. He is the new long snapper for Green Bay. Hunter Bradley is out. And listen, for anyone that's followed the team closely, I think Bill Huber asked like 3 or 4 questions this offseason as to like, is Hunter Bradley going to be okay? Like, he's missed multiple snaps. Like, Bill was like logging the bad snaps in training camp, and Hunter Bradley had a lot of them. He had more bad snaps during the regular season once the season started. This makes sense. You have a mini bye coming up where you can kind of reconfigure some things, get a new long snapper in there, have Bojorquez work with him a little bit more and Crosby work with him a little bit more. Just simply put, Bradley was not good. He had multiple low snaps to Bojorquez. He had on punts, he had multiple low snaps on kicks with Crosby kicking. That whole functionality of the field goal unit, extra point unit has been off. Hunter Bradley is absolutely a part of that. And again, frankly, he just hasn't been good at it. So in comes Stephen Wirtle. We will see if he can be a true upgrade at the position. One thing we will say about Bradley, even though he has struggled rather mightily over his time in Green Bay, he hasn't had any like egregious snap, like one that's like dribbling back to the punter or something like that, where, you have a nightmare snap or a nightmare scenario. So he hasn't been that egregious, and that'll be something that Green Bay has to be cognizant of, is can Wirtle avoid the major mistakes as a long snapper, but it shouldn't be hard to outsnap Bradley, who has struggled so far these last few seasons. Other news and notes, Kurt Benkert heads to the practice squad COVID IR. He is diagnosed with COVID, as he mentioned on Twitter, and he said he gets to spend a little bit more time playing Call of Duty this week, so maybe not the biggest loss for Benkert, but obviously I'm sure he wants to be out there with his teammates, and you just don't want to see any additional, COVID updates from Green Bay. You want to see this just kind of work itself out and get out of the Packers locker room, but obviously that was not the case. Benkert goes on the IR list for the practice squad. Abdullah Anderson signed to the practice squad. Aaron Udayoye is released off the practice squad. And of course, maybe the biggest news of the day, Jaylon Smith is released. As I mentioned, when Green Bay signed him, he just doesn't have it left. And listen, this is not me rubbing it in or gloating, because I would have loved Jaylon Smith to be successful. As I've mentioned to you guys multiple times before, I would much rather be wrong and the Packers be right and the Packers be great than me be right. Nobody benefits from me being right and the Packers being wrong, right? So I wish that Brian Gutekunst would have hit on another player and Jaylon Smith would have come in and been a revelation at linebacker, the way that Rasul Douglas has been at corner, Devondre Campbell, Corey Bojorquez, etc. But it just wasn't the case. And one of the things I give Brian Gutekunst a ton of credit for is cutting ties when it's time to cut ties. Jaylon Smith didn't look good in Dallas. They release him. Green Bay picks him up as a flyer and says, hey, maybe we can make something out of this. They give him 2 weeks to see, hey, what does he have? And give him some snaps, realize he just doesn't have it, and they move on. And that's a great way of doing business. Now, maybe, playing those snaps in a regular season game, not necessarily ideal if you're just experimenting with stuff, but I also get the desire to try to put this player who has, had in the past a ton of potential, has great leadership traits, and to see if he can fit, to see if he can make something work. And when you realize he can't, when you realize he just doesn't have it, you move on and you figure out something else. I love that from Brian Gutekunst. And recently they've signed, they traded for Isaac Yiadom, they signed Douglas, they signed Quentin Dunbar to the practice squad, they signed Jaylon Smith, they signed Whitney Merciless. Like, yes, you would love for all of these players to turn out, but if you can hit on 1 or 2 of those, you were doing insanely well. And right now it looks like they hit on Rasul Douglas, it looks like they hit on Whitney Merciless, and everything else is gravy at that point. And I think that one of the best things that you can do is when you try out these players, low risk, potential high reward, or at least reward, is if it doesn't work out, move on and go to the next player. And I think Brian Gutekunst deserves kudos and more credit for, they could have easily kept Jaylon Smith around. And going back to Jaylon Smith's clearly better than Ty Summers. Why is Jaylon Smith released and Ty Summers still on the roster? It's a message I've received on Twitter and seen on Twitter over and over. Well, you're comparing apples to oranges. You might say, well, Andy, they're both linebackers. They're both inside linebackers. These are not 2 different players. Who would you rather have starting at linebacker right now, Jaylon Smith or Ty Summers? The answer is clearly Jaylon Smith. You're not wrong, but you are ignoring the fact that these are not 2 linebackers. And what I mean by that is Ty Summers is a starter on special teams and an emergency linebacker. Jaylon Smith is the 4th linebacker. Yes, behind Devondre Campbell, behind Chris Barnes, and behind Oren Burks. He's the 4th linebacker and can't play on special teams. So neither player in most situations is playing as a linebacker. But one of them is a starter on most special teams units. The more important player for your team is Ty Summers in that situation. The guy who can play special teams, the guy who's a starter and on most special teams units. So yes, while Jaylon Smith might be a pure pound for pound better linebacker at this point, A, it's not by much. And B, the other guy's a starter on special teams and Jaylon Smith can't play it at all. So you're not comparing apples to apples. Ty Summers, starter on special teams, emergency linebacker. Jaylon Smith, emergency linebacker, no special teams. Ty Summers wins that battle, which is why he's on the roster right now, and Jaylon Smith is not. Couple other quick notes. Deshaun Jackson was released by the Rams. Could Green Bay pick him up? Maybe. I don't see it happening. I'm not willing. I tweeted out yesterday, if Green Bay made a major move at the trade deadline, I would do the one-chip challenge, which if you're not familiar with, look it up. It would have been very painful. In a way, I'm happy Green Bay didn't make a major trade because of that, but I'm not willing to bet a one-chip challenge on Deshaun Jackson not being a Packer. He does have some connections with Aaron Rodgers there. Obviously, both played at Cal, but I don't expect that to happen. Again, not a blocker, not exactly what Green Bay is looking for within the scheme of their offense. If MVS was out an extended period, maybe you could put in a Deshaun Jackson in that role. Just don't see it happening. And then the other pieces, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but now that the deadline's over, everyone that's released is put on waivers. And Green Bay, with their NFL best record, is at the very bottom of the list for waiver priority. So if anyone's cut moving forward, whether it's a veteran, whether it is a rookie, anything in between, Green Bay has to go through the entire waiver process, and everyone else has dibs before Green Bay at this. Like, there could be some tiebreakers at the end where maybe they're 30th or 31st instead of 32nd, but you get my point. They're at the bottom of the list, and it's going to be tough to claim players if there's a really good player that's released. Had they wanted to make a big deal, they would have had to do it at the deadline. They didn't, and now this is sort of their team. That's not such a bad thing. They have a very talented team. That does it for me today. I went way longer than I wanted to. I'm about to pass out, but I appreciate you joining me. I appreciate you subscribing to and listening to the Pack a Day podcast. It insanely means so much to me. And thank you. That's all I have to say. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.